the Middle Ages. Examples of the church or civil authorities using these superstitions to provide some sort of governance that they weren't able to without. So today we're going to look in a remote region in India where they used to practice human sacrifice. And we'll see why this human sacrifice is actually something that was useful for them for, well, without giving away, just saying to help make their society better. So we might think that sacrificing people to appease the gods, spending a lot of money on this and like having these elaborate ceremonies would be an example of something that's extremely irrational, that has no practical purpose. But it turns out that's not the case. Now, the human sacrifice we're looking at is the Khans of Orissa in India. It's a little bit different than other types of human sacrifice. So the Aztec human sacrifice, which is like the most common one most people think about when they think of human sacrifice, is they would kill criminals or enemy soldiers and sacrifice them to the gods. That was really just a way to execute criminals and to give it some sort of religious trappings to make it seem less bad. But the Khans, what they did is actually sacrifice innocent people. So we'll see why this took place.
Welcome to class. Smart.
Speaking of extra credit, in case you didn't see on Canvas, the reminder that extra credit assignment, make up your own news story with a fun 2020 headline. You get 5 points on the final exam. 3 of the points are for how funny the story is. 2 of them if you are for actually doing economic analysis. And whoever has the funniest one is voted on by my friends gets 1 point on their final grade as well. So you can pick up a lot of points doing that. And hopefully have a little bit of fun, right? Human sacrifice in pop culture, there's a picture there, kind of hard to tell on the screen, from Indiana Jones and Temple of Doom, where they have human sacrifice going on with the weird cult that he accidentally falls into. So what happened is the British chased some Indian leader from their colonial area into the remote mountains because he refused to pay some sort of taxes that were owed to the British government. As they send the military after him into this remote region, they find these small communities living up there in the mountains that they had not previously contacted. So the British kept the military there for some time looking for that Indian leader because they wanted their money. And the standard British thing to do is they tried to extend their colonial influence over this region, again, to get more money and spices. Kind of ironic, you had British cooking, characteristically not spicy and pretty bland. But for some reason they were after spices all the time. Now they witnessed this human sacrifice, festivals going on in all these communities every single year. And they set up a local government in an attempt to end this practice. They wanted to end this barbaric human sacrifice of innocents. Lucky for us, the British had meticulous documentation of everything that occurred about the entire practice. So we have a very detailed picture of what life was like for this group of people in the 1800s, and a good look at what they actually did, how their ceremonies took place. So who were the Khans? They were an indigenous Indian peoples located in the eastern province of Orissa. The eastern Ghats mountain range, they basically lived up in those mountains. They cut across eastern India, and then the region overlapped Madras and Bengal, which are 2 colonial districts of the British that now have different names based on what the locals actually want to call it. They had a primarily agricultural society. They produced rice, oils, fruit, tobacco, and some spices. And they also raised some animals like buffaloes, goats, pigs, and poultry. Despite being a fairly primitive society, not having much developed technology, even compared to other regions within India, their agriculture was able to producing pretty good harvests. They could have the British called affluence. which depended on the capricious climate. So there was local weather that changed from year to year that could be very destructive, or it could provide, like a really good harvest. And there's also like pests and other animals which could eat the crops. So some years, if they had misfortune, they would have basically not quite starvation, but there would be a severe shortage of food. So they'd have a famine. But other years, when they had good rain and they didn't have the pests bothering them, coming in and eating their crops, they could have quite a bit of extra food. So there's this wide disparity going on from year to year and between communities, which were fairly spread out in this region. The population was about several 100,000 people, divided into a number of large communities spread out. And there's frequent warfare going on between the tribes. There was government within the communities, but between the communities there was no government. So what they would do is if one of them didn't have a very good harvest, they would come in, raid the other village, raid one of the other communities, take their property, take whether it was food or the animals or the tools they needed, so they could have enough to survive that year. One of the quotes from the British is their favorite phrase is that they seize whatever they like best, which happens to be just those things that their neighbors also most esteem. So there was a lot of conflict between these different communities within this region. And communities tried to build some defensive structures, but the terrain wasn't very hospitable for building forts and stuff, rather defensive encampments or things like that. And they didn't have a lot of more defensive weapons. They didn't even use shields. So the warfare between them was very bloody, very deadly. So warfare would be extremely costly, not just from the stuff they would steal from the other communities, but also from the devastation and the killing of the soldiers, both attacking and defending. So we see a significant cost because of this. Now let's move on to how the sacrifice actually looked before we talk about what it was trying to solve. So the Mareyas were people that were purchased and they were sacrificed in these festivals. So the communities would actually purchase an individual or multiple individuals to be sacrificed. They could be any age, any sex, any race, any case. That didn't matter. It was just the fact that they were an innocent person, not a criminal. But in practice, they were almost always from outside these communities. So they lived up in those mountains. They would purchase someone from down in the communities below that weren't part of their community. The sacrifice was an elaborate affair, so it involved rituals for preparing the people who were to be sacrificed, rituals for the sacrifice itself, and then rituals for stuff after the sacrifice. And this was celebrated very publicly, and these were very social affairs. And people from neighboring communities would come in to watch the sacrifice and take part in these celebrations. Every year, every community held at least one of these festivals, if not more. So it was a very common practice that we see across the entire region. Sometimes a single Mareya was sacrificed at these events. Sometimes these ceremonies had tons of them, so upwards of 20, 30, sometimes even 50 being sacrificed at once. These festivals where they sacrificed people were large, raucous 3-day parties where attendees engaged in, and I quote, the indulgence of every form of wild riot and generally of gross excess. So basically your St. Francis homecoming. The villages that compose each community would take turns sponsoring the festival. So each community of Khans would have several villages within it. All those villages within there would take turns hosting one of these. So basically everyone within these communities at some point would be heavily involved running these. So again, extremely common and everyone doing it. The participants would take part in all these prayers and supplications to an earth goddess. Teripinu, to whom the sacrifice was being offered. So you'd have a priest leading these prayers, and the head of the village, and the person who sold the Maria would all be heavily involved in these rituals. So this seems like a very odd practice to us, very different from what we're used to, or even very different from the weird things that the Catholics in Europe used to do. Well, the question is, what if this wasn't so crazy? What if there was actually a solution? Remember I said the warfare was extremely destructive. You had not only massive death from both the attacking party and the defending party, but you also had a lot of property being taken and being destroyed. And you have the constant need to, defend yourself or be ready to defend yourself rather than trying to make your life better. So because this was so destructive, human sacrifice may have been a method that they used to actually preserve their property, so they didn't have to constantly defend themselves against attacks. So the basic idea is, some of these communities would be very poor. They'd be suffering famines because, the weather was bad or the pests were bad that year. Whereas other communities would be very, very wealthy because they had great harvests. So what they would do is destroy some of that wealth, destroy some of that harvest, so you didn't have someone willing to attack you. If you're not rich, you're not going to have that, they're not going to get that benefit from taking your stuff. So without a government that overarched all these communities to settle disputes between them, what we saw is they created this religious ceremony to protect them from warfare. So this reduced warfare between these communities. So think of a theory behind this. You've got several different communities living in an area near each other. And every year they're going to have different outputs. And the different outputs of agriculture aren't based on really anything going into it. It's not based off of how much they choose to plant, the land that they have. It's based on randomly occurring weather. So it's something outside of their control and very difficult for them to anticipate. So poor neighbors that randomly get low output that year, can choose to capture some of the wealth from their neighbors that have good output. So the wealthy community, they can either pay the bribe, they can either, if they're going to be attacked, they see the attack coming, they can come out and say, hey, we'll bribe you to stay away, or they can defend. Either one is going to be costly, but if they end up fighting, both sides are going to suffer losses, so both end up with negative. So no matter what, the unlucky community, they have a dominant strategy. That dominant strategy is to attack their neighbors. No matter whether they get the bribe or whether they fight, odds are they're going to be made better off by fighting. Even though they're going to lose a bunch of people in that attack, the chance of getting that extra wealth that they steal from their attack is going to be worth the risk. Now, since the unlucky communities are always going to threaten their neighbors, because that's always going to, odds are it's going to always make them better off. You have a higher probability of being made better off if they attack, even if they lose. Knowing that, the community that has the good output that year, because they know they're going to be attacked, they're going to defend themselves with violence. And they're going to be threatening their neighbors. So basically what's going to happen is that all communities are going to be threatening their neighbors. Without any sort of, without like the human sacrifice ritual we see being developed. Both the rich communities and the poor communities, and again, these are going to change every single year. Both of these are going to make themselves as well off as possible, given what the other is going to do, if they attack each other. So we're going to see a lot of violence. So the best way to avoid this is to make the benefits of war much lower compared to the cost. So we're talking about just changing incentives here. So those rich communities, the ones that do well randomly, unexpectedly, what they do is destroy their extra wealth. by destroying that extra wealth above what they need to survive, what they end up doing is, they don't have that extra wealth for their opponents to steal, for the neighboring communities to steal. So they now lack that incentive to come over and try to attack them and, take their stuff. Which seems counterintuitive. But there's a good quote from Lycurgus, one of the early Spartan leaders. He said, "By remaining poor, each man not desiring to possess more than his fellow, Sparta is able to avoid invasion." He was asked by, someone from, I think, Athens, one of the other Greek city-states. Literally just said, by being poor, that's how we prevent being attacked. So that's a basic theory of what we saw happen in these communities. However, we need certain rules that have to be followed in order for this to make sense and for this to actually work. So first, the wealth destruction must be what we call preemptive. If your neighbors have chosen to threaten you, they're already, the next community is marching, they're right outside your gates, you can't then destroy your property then. It's going to be too late. So you've got to do it before the harvest, before you know how well you've actually done, and before your neighbors know how well you've done. You have to commit to it ahead of time. Next, the wealth destruction has to be public and it has to be verifiable. So your neighbor, the next community that's going to attack you or may attack you, has to know that you destroyed the wealth. If they don't know this already, if it's not easily visible to them, then they can't take it into account when they're making the decision to attack you or not. So because the wealth destruction is before these communities know how wealthy they are or not, and how wealthy their neighbors are or not, they need to be able to see this, to take this into account, to understand, or to be able to estimate how well these communities are doing. So one way to do this is to have someone from your community go out to all the other communities and see, how wealthy they are if they're destroying their wealth. But this is going to be pretty costly and a long process. Maybe the person gets threatened at one of these communities and goes back and lies about their wealth, under the threat of death. So, a much easier way to do it is to make this, like a public ceremony. And to do something that can't be faked. So if you just burn a bunch of crops, you could put, a bunch of trees, a bunch of bushes, grass clippings, whatever, a big pile of that, and then put a bunch of corn on the outside. Have it look like a giant pile of corn, but really it's mostly fake. Like my cousin Vinny, when the guy goes to pay him, and he has a 20 wrapped around a bunch of ones. Same basic idea, where you put something less valuable in the middle. That's fairly easy to fake. Human sacrifice, difficult to fake. You've got an actual person you're dealing with. There may be other ways besides human sacrifice to, show that what you're destroying is actually the full value of what you claim it is. But human sacrifice is one way to do that. And finally, the contributions to the wealth that's going to be destroyed has to be incentivized within the community. So the members of the community have to have a reason to be willing to do this. You can think of providing the wealth to be destroyed as a common good. So basically, this is like national defense. Once the wealth is provided and it's destroyed, there's zero marginal cost of protecting more of the people in the community. So in theory, if one person gives a bunch of wealth to be destroyed, that gets destroyed, no one else has any incentive to provide any more because they're now already protected. And you can't limit the protection to just the people that have given the money. So again, basically a public good. So you've got to figure out some way to incentivize people, to give their wealth over to be destroyed. Or else every person is going to try to, free ride on the contribution of others. So you have to figure out some way that individuals get some private benefit in addition to the protection of the community. There has to be something else going on. the religious aspect. So the first and the last rule are fairly easy to meet, but the second rule can be difficult. Again, you can't just burn and defile the crops. But like I said, human sacrifice fits it pretty well because it's hard to fake killing a human. And while like word of burning some crops may reach some like neighboring communities, it's not going to reach very far. It's not like that newsworthy. Whereas a human sacrifice, extremely newsworthy. Especially when there's like a big ceremony attached to it, a big celebration attached to it. Then these things become much larger spectacles. Now, if we're talking about human sacrifice, there's two additional rules that we have to consider. The first is that the human sacrifice has to destroy valuable property. So like the Aztecs, how they would sacrifice criminals, if the Khan would try to do that, sacrificing a criminal doesn't harm the community. It actually makes the community better off. So if you sacrifice, someone who steals from like their neighbors, that's not going to be you're not going to be destroying wealth by doing that. What they have to do is convert their property, take the excess wealth that they have, and convert that into a person to sacrifice. So what they did is they purchased someone to sacrifice. Again, that costs a lot of money, so it's going to reduce the amount of wealth they have. Again, reduce the incentive for their neighboring communities to attack them. And finally, the sacrificed humans have to be purchased from outsiders. So again, if it's someone purchased within the community, then you're paying someone in the community. So the wealth is just moving from one person to another, one group of people to another. So it's not making the community any more poor. So their neighbors still have this incentive to attack them. When you purchase from outside the community, it depresses the community's wealth and what their neighbors expect their level of wealth to be. So because it reduces wealth, then it becomes effective. So what evidence do we have that the Khan human sacrifice actually meets these rules that we need for human sacrifice to be an effective way to protect yourself from neighbors, coming in and attacking you for your property? Well, the first, human sacrifice destroys valuable property. So the religious tradition that existed required that these Marias be purchased. And there was a rule that it had to be expensive. So as one of the British officers writing about it said, in all cases it must be bought with a price, an unbought or unpurchased life being an abomination to the deity. So they would trade their land, their agricultural output, work animals, tools, all these different things that were valuable for these human sacrifice victims. So basically, as they're sacrificing this victim, as they're killing this person, they're destroying their wealth that they exchange for them. And the unit of account for the property that they would use to purchase the Maria to be sacrificed was called a ganzi, which translates to life. During the actual sacrifice, what they would have is a long call and response between the priest and between a few of the members of the community, including the person they would actually purchase the Maria from, making sure that the person was from outside their community. They would ask them specifically, are they from outside the community? They'd ask them, like, have they been purchased with the product of this year's harvest, things like that. And as they moved the victim up to be sacrificed, the crowd would chant, "We bought you with a price." So it's signifying to the outsiders over there that they had spent a big portion of their wealth on this sacrifice. Second, the wealth destruction has to be preemptive. So these Khan sacrifices, they corresponded to the growing cycle, and they were before the harvest. The key being, before the harvest, you didn't know exactly how much wealth you were going to have, so everyone committed to this ahead of time. So each community knew that all the other ones were destroying this extra wealth that they would have, so there's no reason to go attack them. So they would sacrifice humans between the sowing of the crops and the harvesting of the crops. So they would commit to this ahead of time. No community knew how well their growing season was going to go before or even like midway through the growing season. So they couldn't choose whether or not to attack their neighbors, whether they needed to or not, and whether or not their neighbors had enough property to steal at this time. And again, everyone's sacrificing it, so everyone was taking part in this. So everyone had the same incentives in these communities. So it was before they destroyed their property, before other communities could mobilize to attack them, and before they could make the decision to mobilize to attack other communities. So these are done preemptively, they're being done ahead of time. Next, the wealth destruction is public and verifiable. They went through great pains to make these ceremonies quite large, and people from all different communities would attend. So you had witnesses from all around the area. According to McPherson, one of the British officers, from these festivals, no one is excluded. Another described the sacrifice had to be efficacious. It had to be celebrated in public before all these assembled people. So it was widely known that this was occurring. The British noted that the people from neighboring communities at these festivals kept arriving in multitudes, that people from all around the region, from different communities, would show up to witness and celebrate, take part in these festivals. And there's an additional way that they made this public and made this verifiable, is that someone from each community, representing their community, would take a piece of the sacrificed person back to their village. And part of the religious ceremony was to plant it in one of the fields owned by the village. So this way, taking a piece home, easily verifiable, and shows that this sacrifice actually took place to the people that live in the community. So everyone in the community knows that their neighbors destroyed their wealth. Again, you could see like if someone went from the village, they just sent one witness to another community, it'd be much cheaper to bribe that one individual than to go through this whole ceremony and buy all this. So by taking a piece home, you know that this actually took place. Contributions to the wealth destined for destruction has to be incentivized. So what they did is they made it a religious obligation. So it's kind of like what we saw with Mormon trials, because there's this belief in like the supernatural. These sacrifices were made to appease the deity, who was one of the things she oversaw was the harvest and like personal like fortune, not like money wise, but like good things happening in your life. So now by contributing some property to this, what they're doing is making themselves better off, making themselves more holy, giving themselves a better relationship with that deity. So they're tying the provision of a public good to a private good, kind of like the British lighthouses that would charge a fee for like the boats that stopped in the bay. Turn a public good, tie it to a private good, and then you don't need, I don't know. Typically we have government provide private goods. They have no government, so they tied it to a private good. So now individuals are more than happy to pay for it. And finally, human sacrifices have to be purchased from outsiders. The fact that you had to purchase an outsider made it that, like, obviously you had to purchase from an outsider as well. Much easier than someone in the community leaving and going to find someone. They just purchase it from someone outside the community. They would have the seller there to provide kind of like a sales receipt to help prove that this person was from outside the community. And again, part of the ceremony was the seller testifying, stating to everyone publicly that this was from outside the community. Typically, the people who sold the Moreas were from the untouchable case, which is like the largest segment of Indian society at the time. They lived either outside of the Khan region, so they would be like, Khans live up like in the mountains, they would live like down like in the more populous valley, take people from down there and sell them to the Khan. Or sometimes they would live outside the communities, so they would live like just outside the villages. But because they were part of the untouchable case, they weren't allowed to live within the community. All right, so if this sacrifice was so great, if it was so good at solving these problems, then why the hell did they stop doing it? Basically what happened is this human sacrifice ended when the government protected the property rights. So when the British first found it, there were 2 attempts they had to end the practice. The first was their typical response. They tried to turn them into like good British people, have them adopt their culture, and do so on the penalty of death. They told them, if you keep doing this, we're going to come in and we're going to kill the people who are, continuing the human sacrifice, things like that. They also tried to convince them by like educating them that this is a bad thing because the human sacrifices kept continuing year after year. They tried to convince them that this is a barbarous practice, that this is bad, like you can't kill people in human sacrifices. But neither of them worked. Sometimes when the British Army during these festival seasons would go through the communities, sometimes they would try to fight off the British who were trying to take the Marias. Sometimes the communities would give them like 1 or 2, claim that's all they were going to sacrifice, and keep more back, sacrifice them once the British left. So finally, Captain McPherson said, you know what, I'm just going to ask them, what the hell do they want? We'll trade them something. We'll bribe them to even stop doing it. So he went to the different communities and said, like, what trade can I make? What the hell can I do to get you guys to stop doing this? He asked them what their greatest need was. And their response is that they needed protection from these other communities from destroying their property. So McPherson offered them to arbitrate, not just between the individuals of the same tribe. He would let the communities handle that, but he would arbitrate between the different communities. They immediately agreed to abandon the human sacrifice. They had no more reason to do this now that they didn't have, the threat of other communities coming in and destroying their wealth. So he said, the Khans most anxiously desire of us justice, not between man and man, which our own institutions can afford, but betwixt tribes and their divisions, which authority of those institutions is too feeble to reach. Again, once they began offering protection between one tribe and another, between one community and another, offering to settle these disputes and to protect them from attacking each other, immediately the practice went away. So for example, one of the local leaders promised to relinquish from henceforth the right of human sacrifice on the condition that the British immediately begin protecting their community, and that they'll be able to obtain justice from the British colonial army and governance. So while human sacrifice, killing an innocent person to appease the gods, especially in such a large ceremony, may seem like such a crazy, irrational thing, this is actually done to protect themselves from constant warfare and constant attack. And if you think that, sacrificing people is bloody, that it's still a bad thing, think of how many fewer people were killed during the fighting, let alone how many fewer people didn't have to deal with starving to death. So it actually makes quite a bit of sense when you realize what the problems these people were facing were, and the lack of, typical government they had overarching them to settle their disputes. All right. Got a little bit of time left. I'll go back earlier in this and hit maledictions real quick. So during the Middle Ages, what these monastic communities used to do is curse people that they thought were their enemies. We took liturgical benedictions or divine blessings that follow these very specific, rites within the Catholic Church based on based on the Bible and based on the typical structure of the Mass. Medieval clerics would use basically this kind of structure, but instead of calling down a blessing upon themselves and the community, what they would do is they'd call curses on other people. Now, this practice mainly took place in Western Francia, modern-day France, from 900 to 1100 AD. What happened is the Carolingian dynasty fell, and once that fell, the governance that they provided went with them. So basically, you had a bunch of local strongmen in castles, what we imagine the Middle Ages to be, all fighting with each other, trying to take land from other people. There was no government to protect any property rights of the individuals there. The largest landowners at this time were these clerical communities. They were given quite a bit of land. Even though the monks themselves took a vow of poverty, they didn't have very many possessions. The land that the monastery owned and the properties, all the different buildings and stuff they had were quite large and quite valuable. So because we had this lack of government at the time, in order to protect their property rights, these monks needed to come up with a different way to protect themselves. So these clerical communities were officially the property not of the community, but of the saints in whose name they were established. And according to the popular belief at the time, throughout France, it was the saints' duty to protect those communities. So when the monks, when their monasteries' property rights came under attack, what they would do is turn to their patron saints to help protect them from whoever was trying to oppress them. So there were three different types of maledictions. The first was the liturgical maledictio. So this is literally a full Catholic Mass that you can go down to the chapel and experience. But interspersed in that Mass were prayers of curse, calling upon this God and the saints to curse whoever the malediction was being placed upon. Next was a clamor, which wasn't technically a curse, but it basically acted like a curse. It was a vigorous appeal to gods or to saints. These were very public. Sometimes they were pleas, so very loud public prayers for God or for saints to smite someone. Other times it would be actual humiliation, so they would take the relics of saints. Relics in the Catholic Church, first-class relics being part of the body of one of the saints. They would take them and throw them on the ground. They would stomp on them, kick dirt on them, things like that, to call upon the saints to ask God to smite the individual. And finally, they would use excommunication and anathema. So they would kick whoever out of the church, remove them from any chance of heaven, force them, to rot in hell for eternity. There's some examples of maledictions. So Pope Benedict VIII used this malediction. He said, "May they be cursed in the east, disherited in the west, interdicted in the north, and excommunicated in the south. May they be cursed in the day and excommunicated at night. May they be cursed at home and excommunicated while away. Cursed in standing and excommunicated in sitting. May they be cursed in the spring and excommunicated in the summer. Cursed in the autumn and excommunicated in the winter." You guys notice anything about this curse? Cursing people in the east, west, north, and south, day and night, at home and away. Basically, covering everything, right? It's going to be very important. Remember, at the time, there's weak, non-existent government, so there's no authority able to enforce private property rights. And these monks surrendered all means to self-protection. They couldn't, pick up arms and defend themselves. So there's no way they couldn't use armies, use violence to attack these warlords or these tribal chieftains that were trying to steal their property. So they used these maledictions. They would try to curse these people. Call upon God's curse as a threat. That was like the only attack they had. So first they had to be grounded in their target's existing beliefs. So if these warlords were like, if they were Catholics, if they believed that God had this power, then curses could work. Curses also had to be monopolized by the cursors. So, only the monks, only people that have been, that have taken holy orders are able to do a mass. They're the only ones with the authority to excommunicate someone. So it needs to be something, needs to be like tied to liturgy so that only the monks are able to do this and their opponents can't just curse them back. Because their opponents just curse them back, then there's nothing. They just like kind of cancel out. There's no additional penalty for that. And finally, curses have to be unfalsifiable. So that's why we see Benedict talking about east, west, north, and south, and home and away, at all the different times of the year. They have to be able to, they can't be proven wrong. If I ask God to strike someone down right now and it doesn't happen, then it looks like I have no power. But if I ask for you to be cursed at day and at night, when you're awake and when you're asleep, your head and your foot, and your hands and your heart, make it very, very broad. Anything bad that happens to you could be thought to be from that curse. So sometimes these were used to enforce clerical contracts. So when people would die, they would, leave property to the church. Again, this being feudal Europe, unless you were like the king of the country, there was someone above you that had claim to your property. So sometimes the person's heir or sometimes the lord above them would renege on the donation. So all parties would, formally agree usually to this, and they would have cursing contracts in the clause that said if you try to take this land from us, we will curse you. But still, this was fairly common that the lord or the person's children would try to get that land back from these monastic communities. They were also used to prevent the theft of existing property. So, 900 AD, Viking raids are still going on all across Europe at this time. So they need something to be able to defend themselves from being attacked. And there was no central authority. There was no king of France to protect against these regional nobles from coming in and trying to expand their property. So basically what we see is that these curses are ways to protect their property. They only existed in Western France where there was no government protection. Other places in Europe where they didn't have this breakdown of private property protection, we didn't see these maledictions occurring. Very small regional things to solve this problem that they had no protection. Again, this required, going back to the rules, the people had to be Catholic, they had to be members of the faith. If they didn't believe, in the God that the monks were calling upon, then this isn't going to work. So, the Spanish couldn't do this to protect themselves from the invasion by the Moors later, because, the Moors didn't believe, in the same religion that the Spaniards did. And again, because we have all this authority being vested in the clergy of the church, that they have a better relationship with God, able to just communicate with him more than the common person, they had a monopoly on these curses. And finally, they were super broad. They seemed very specific, and that's why we saw, Benedict's long curse stating all these different specific times, but ended up covering everything. Again, if you could prove that it was wrong, prove that this curse was ineffective, then people would be more than willing to attack. But if you made it seem as if it could cover anything, that's exactly what these curses did, then it would appear that any misfortune that befell you was because of this curse. So they'd appear much more powerful. All right, with that, we'll end class for the day.